So consider vector V good old physicist notation, which is in the carrier space of SO3. Associate a matrix and now I put this what is this called? It's called Blackboard font in tech. So you double this line. So V equal to V dot tau, where tau are the sigma matrices of Pauli matrices. And let me write over here a little note about the notation. Tau I and sigma I will both be used for the same set of matrices, the Pauli matrices. Sigma, if it has to signify spin, spin and physics, tau in group theory. At least that is the convention in my mind, and you will find that that is roughly true in many books. So it's just they are the same matrices, just that we call them tau 1, tau 2, tau 3. So we define 2 by 2. This is of course 2 by 2 complex matrices. V made up of this. So if you want, we can write this out in detail. What it will become is, so V1 times tau 1 will basically put the V1 here, then V2 times tau 2, so minus I V2 and plus I V2, and V3 times tau 3, so V3 minus V3. So this is what this matrix looks like. So out of our 3D vector, we create this 2 by 2 complex matrix like this. What is interesting about this is that we can define a inner product V comma W equal to trace of V times W. Okay. And we will see that this reproduces V dot W, because so how does it work? Remember that trace of tau I tau j was equal to 2 times delta ij, right, because the tau matrices themselves are traceless, the sigma matrices are just the Pauli matrices are just traceless, and if you take a product, then you remember that they actually satisfy tau I tau j equal to epsilon ijk times tau k. They basically give the third Pauli matrix. If you take tau 1 tau 2, it gives tau 3 and so on. If you take trace of that, you will again get 0. So only if the two taus are same, delta ij, then it becomes identity matrix. Tau squared is, so this depends on while trace tau I equal to 0 and tau I tau j is tau k if I not equal to j, right. So since if product of two taus gives you a third tau, and if trace of all taus is 0, then this is always going to produce 0 unless I and j coincide and we get identity, in which case we get 2. And therefore if we take this trace of trace VW equal to trace of, so now we will take out VI WK trace of, we get tau I tau k, right, because V is just sum of, so we could have written here sum over I VI tau I, that's what it is. So VI are numbers and tracing has to be done over these matrices, right. So we can pull out the numbers and do trace over this, and this trace is equal to 2 times delta ij so except for a factor 2 we got the inner product back. Okay. So I have to supply a factor 2, or you can define it as half, okay. So we don't have to worry. So we check that this is equal to 2. Trace this is of course twice, so you define the inner product to be half of that, so that it is exactly the same inner product. Right. So what is going on? From the 3D language, 3-dimensional rows and columns, we switch to some 2 by 2 complex matrices, but we are recovering the same geometrical or mathematical properties of this V and W. In fact, we can now check that these act as SU2 representations. Okay. So if U belongs to SU2, so compare OV equal to O acting on V1, V2, V3 for SO3. Now the same where O is belonging to this, I am sorry, O belonging to SO3. So these same real numbers V1, V2, V3 which appeared as column vectors and with one helping of O are now transforming here by two helpings of U. If you have an SU2 element, then there is a adjoint action or an action like a similarity transformation. So U acts through similarity transformation. What is called adjoint action. Whereas O acts through left action, left multiplication. So on the same carrier space, we can have both kinds of actions, either the left action by the real matrices O or the adjoint action which looks like a similarity transformation by the SU2 matrices, and we check that action, SU2 action, preserves this trace operation. Check that the inner product is preserved by the SU2 action, because we need to check that trace of VW, trace VW, well, is going to be invariant it is obvious, you do not have to compute anything. Right, because you insert these in the trace, firstly this U inverse U is going to multiply in the middle, and then under trace you can always cyclically change the order of the matrices. So it will become so it preserves the inner product. In other words, it preserves the metric meant for the three-dimensional vectors. You know, in metric language, this V dot W was actually V transpose the delta metric of Pythagorean metric. So it basically preserved this delta, and we see that here SU2 is preserving the same delta. So actually the two groups have a very close correspondence, but it is not isomorphism. Double valuedness of SU2. So this double is of course with respect to SO3. And this has been a source of great mystery and mysticism even for very important physicists in quantum mechanics, because the tau matrices or sigma matrices were first invented for spin, and this double valuedness remained a big mystery for everyone from Pauli to later Wheeler and Roger Penrose. Okay, so from Pauli to Penrose. They have all been amused by this, and Penrose of course has a whole program of quantizing gravity using the representation similar to what I said, but for the Lorentz group, not rotation group. Okay, so what is this double valuedness? The point is that SU2 U n cap theta was equal to cos theta by 2 times identity. Note, lot of books don't write this identity, but it is important to remember it is there. Okay, this is how the group works out to be. Now let us look at the range over which this theta goes. Okay, so we can see that when theta is equal to pi by 2, sorry 2 pi, what am I saying? So when you go to theta equal to 2 pi, you get cos pi. So you get a minus 1, and sine of pi is 0. Okay. So at 2 pi you don't return to identity, while the O elements, let us say O generated by theta along z axis. So what was our notation? That Rz of 2 pi, which would be exponential of 2 pi times Lz, right? But what is this exponential was just cos theta, sin theta, etc. So it was just cos 2 pi minus sin 2 pi and sin 2 pi. So that is just equal to identity. There is a third 0, 0, 0, 1. Okay. So it was just equal to 3 by 3 identity. So Rz 2 pi or Rx, Ry, anything you want, it just basically became cosine on the diagonal, and with the whichever axis that was not being turned, this one just migrates here. If you change to x or y, migrates up the diagonal, but the other elements are just cos and sine, and exactly at 2 pi you get back to cosines becoming 1 and the sines becoming 0 with no overall sign appearing. But here at 2 pi, these 2 by 2 complex matrices of SU2 don't return to identity, but only to minus 1. Okay. And so what we find is that there is a two valuedness. There are two SU2 matrices And of course, we know that un cap of 4 pi would be equal to 1. If you put 4 pi, then you will get back identity. So there are two SU2 matrices for every O matrix. And that is because of the adjoint action. U V U inverse, which is how you transform any V, is same as minus U V minus U inverse. So if U carries out the required rotation, so does minus U, and minus U is actually a distinct matrix, it is not just U itself. So U and minus U are both doing to vectors V the same thing and for which there will be only one corresponding rotation matrix, ordinary rotation matrix. So there is a two valuedness, and that was what was observed here. Both the 2 pi value and 4 pi value will look like identity operation as far as the V matrices are concerned. Whether you put un cap of 2 pi, which would give -1 and a -1, so it will look okay, it will look like ordinary rotation of a 3D vector, and so will 4 pi. However, the representation which is the complex 2D vector the two-dimensional complex carrier space does know the difference between U and minus U. In quantum mechanics, we simply call these spinors. We call these spin matrices or spin wave functions. Times psi, where psi and psi are two-dimensional complex vectors, and phi is space part. Well, you want to put t, you put t, space-time part. So we split the wave function of the electron. So this is of course non-relative, all but you can split the wave function into a spin part and a space part, and you will find this language in lot of the nuclear physics and condensed matter physics literature. And now we come to explaining how young Pauli, who was maybe 23 years old or something like that when he invented the Pauli matrices. It is very simple. If you we know there are spin up and spin down. This was what has come to be called Stern-Gerlach. I shouldn't say what has come to be called, but I think historically it was the experiment that was performed by Stern and Gerlach. But that was not origin of Pauli's considerations. He had other things. But I am just saying what I meant by saying what has come to be called is what can see most clearly through Stern-Gerlach experiment is that if you send a mixed beam of electrons through an arrangement of magnets, north and south pole, then this beam will split exactly into two parts. You have prepared an arbitrary, you are heating some silver or something like that. So you have just some vapor of silver coming out, it's all mixed up. But now if you apply this magnetic field, classically you would have expected that it will range over, you will see on the screen, you should see a continuous set of possibilities. Spin is here, spin is here, spin is here. But quantum mechanics just picks out one and the other. So this magnetic field is inhomogeneous, so that it actually can separate out the dipole moments, as you know, right? A homogeneous field won't do much, but inhomogeneous field will separate out the dipole moments. But when that happens, classically you expect the spin to be anything, so it will pick out any projection that is perpendicular to this magnetic field, so it will get attached to it. But quantum mechanically you either find this or you find this and nothing else. It is impossible to get anything in between. So this is the classic experiment that tells you that regardless of what kind of initial state you start with, if you make a measurement, you only find the eigenvalues. The measurements don't return continuous values of the observable in any one observation. The way you recover the sort of quote average is if you do a lot of experiments, then of course the weighted average of these two together will equal the weighted average here, the average spin here. But as the answer will come only as an average, but any one process of one observation event will only return either spin up or spin down. So we know that there are spin up and spin down states. So what would we do logically? And if we believe now the next point, the very, very important point of quantum mechanics, linear superposition principle. So generically, okay, so the very crucial thing is, because there is linear superposition, you write vectors. Vectors are linear spaces. So if this state was supposed to be obeying linear superposition, then it should be expressible as linear superposition of a basis, and that basis, if it is two dimensional, would be just 1 0 and 0 1. Okay. I don't want to launch here into a big lecture, but I just want to tell you very briefly that linear superposition principle is the main positive content of quantum mechanics. Unfortunately, the uncertainty principle is emphasized. There is nothing uncertain about quantum mechanics, it's pretty certain. Its commutation relations will give you the quote Heisenberg uncertainty relations, it is linear superposition principle which is very wrongly sold as uncertainty principle. It is true that your classical expectations are not borne out. You will not be able to measure position very accurately or momentum very accurately. But to couch this as a principle is wrong. The principle is linear superposition, which allows you to have Fourier transform, Fourier series representations, and this delta p delta x relations can be derived in any Fourier transform theory. The width of the function in x space will be inverse of the width of the function in the complementary space. So that is just a result of Fourier transform, and Fourier transform works whenever there is linear superposition, whenever you can obtain functions as linear superpositions of basis functions like sine and cosine, done in Fourier analysis. So it has all to do with linear superposition and nothing else. Okay. So likewise, the so-called wave particle duality is just an oversold point. They are just particles. The wave, people are confused because if you measure a momentum eigenstate, then it is characterized by its wave number. So essentially, when people say wave, what they actually mean is a momentum eigenstate. And a momentum eigenstate, I may as well write this down. So these are the two big misnomers of quantum mechanics and sold to public, and public has bought it, and you will find innumerable philosophical discussions going on about this. It's all garbage. Okay. So the wave particle duality basically is position description or momentum description. And we do know that there is this complementarity. You cannot have both. When you have momentum p, what am I writing? Momentum p, you can associate with it. So you can associate with it a wave number k, which is equal to p over h cross. This is because you have the fundamental constant h cross available. Okay. So to momentum p, you associate a number of dimension 1 over length, and which you define in your wisdom to be equal to 2 pi by lambda. Okay. So this lambda is a product of your fertile imagination. There is no such lambda. The main point is that there is a fundamental number h cross which allows you to think of momentum as a length scale. Okay. And once you introduce a length scale, you say, oh my god, but particle is either here or there, it's a wavelength like this. There is no wavelength, it's a momentum eigenstate. Either you have a momentum description, or in fact neither of them completely precise because of the earlier part, the linear superposition. But the main principle of quantum mechanics is that there is linear superposition, and in any measurement you can observe only one eigenvalue. You cannot observe all mixture of all eigenvalues. It is just that X is a continuous space, so the set of eigenvalues is continuous, so you can come out with any one of them with some weightage. And so that settles this issue of what is the wave. Okay, there is no wave. The wave is essentially a brain wave. And that is because it is possible to associate a wavelength lambda with a momentum eigenstate. So that the real truth of quantum mechanics is momentum eigenstates. Now coming back to this, because of linear superposition, you can write spin as a linear superposition of up or down vectors, and in fact those are the observed eigenstates. And so what you observe, of course, is the magnetic moment physically, but that it's up to mu multiplying this spin vector, it is the same thing. So now what does one see? We can always go from up to down states, right? Physically, up can go to down by application of a magnetic field. If you apply a magnetic field, you can flip the spin. How will you represent this in quantum mechanics? How will you represent it mathematically? Well, it's a linear space, so there should be a linear operator. Okay. So which linear operator will do this? Implements this. So I am very sorry to say, but this business of wave particle duality, all the books that claim themselves to be modern quantum mechanics, they miss it completely. They write fat books and they are very popular because they reinforce what people like to hear. You know, miracles are liked by people. If you tell them the truth, they don't like it because it's a little too simple to understand. But if you tell them that something is very difficult to understand, and in fact tell them that it is something never understandable, then people are drawn to it like honey, you know, honey bees to honey. So most people reinforce this idea that quantum mechanics is not understandable, so then people rush to them. If you tell them that, by the way, what I am telling is nothing new. It is what is written by Dirac in his 1929 book. You have to read Dirac's book. Please don't read any other. So there are only two books to read in quantum mechanics, Dirac and Schiff. Of course, Landau and Lifshitz is always there, volume 3. So these are the books to read in quantum mechanics, and they will tell you unadorned truths, which have, Dirac's is the best, and written in 1929 when people were still puzzling over the interpretations of quantum mechanics. So essentially that is what, but nobody learns from Dirac. And they, somewhere I tried to tell someone and they said, do you really believe Dirac? I felt like telling, do you really believe all the else? Anyway, that's how it is. So how do we get from down to up or up to down? We apply a lowering operator. Equal to something acting on 1, 0. And obviously this can be done by this row into this column. So I have to have 1, right? So this into this 0 and this into this will give 1. So this produces this. Similarly, of course, you can do the reverse by putting a 0, 1, 1, 0, 0 on the down. So you can convert down to up and up to down. And the two states are eigenstates of can be distinguished this matrix 1, 0, 0, minus 1, which on 1, 0 will produce plus 1, 0 and will produce minus 0 1. Okay. So if you apply this matrix on this or on this, you can distinguish the up spin and down spin as eigenstates of this matrix 1 minus 1. So we have a fundamental set of 3 matrices. Zero 1 0 0 1 0 0 1 0 0 and 1 minus 1 0 0. Now with good mathematical sense, you will say, why don't I make some symmetric matrices out of this? So equivalently, what happens if I symmetrize? I get 0 1 1 0, which is sum of these two divided by 2. But the minus 1 if I make, I will get 0, say minus 1 1 0, but I also want it to be a Hermitian matrix. So I make it minus I 0. It is simply I times the difference. And then there is 0 1 0 minus 1. Okay. So these are the equivalent Hermitian set. And what is nice about this is that these 3 Hermitian matrices exhaust the basis for unitary matrices in 2 dimensions. It's quite a remarkable thing. Because we had this A star and B and minus B star. This is how we could characterize a unitary matrix, and then that we wrote out as equal to AR plus IA imaginary part, BR plus IB imaginary part, minus B minus I B imaginary part, sorry, with plus sign now, and AR minus I AI. So it just became equal to AR times identity and plus this AI times IAI times tau 3 plus I BI times tau 2, BR times tau 2 and plus I BI times tau 1. So we have 3 Hermitian matrices which help us to understand the quantum mechanics of spins, which obeys linear superposition principle and has this property that only eigenvalues are returned as a result of measurements. And amusingly, the 3 Hermitian matrices are the basis for the corresponding unitary matrices. This is an accident of 2 dimensions, okay? But a very significant one because it helps us to do a lot of things. So we have seen the origins of both the types of representations. In last 5 minutes, maybe I try to therefore explain to you the topology of SU2 and SU3, which I find the most imaginative exercise, usually not done in physics books, but done in Schiff's book. Topology of SO3 versus SU2. The point is that, so we will try to draw these two spheres, and this will be SO3, and although I promised you that topology has no sense of distance in it, we will draw double the size sphere. So we want to represent something like r n cap theta is exponent theta times theta dot L. Okay, so for simplicity just take this. So suppose you drew axes corresponding to Lx, so these are not real space axes, Ly and Lz. Then the n cap vector, so this theta is often written as n cap times theta. N cap is a vector in this space. It has so it is dotted with L, right? So you can dot it with the Lx, Ly, Lz. So this is n cap, and the rotation amount theta you can show by drawing along it. How much you rotate, so theta values, but they stop at theta equal to pi, because if you do n cap pi rotation and minus n cap pi rotation, you have actually covered 2 pi rotation about that n cap axis. So by convention, so you can take theta equal to, so theta belongs to, let us say 0 to 2 pi, equivalently belongs to minus pi to pi. Okay. And so that is what we do. We make a ball of radius pi. Now to make SU2, we draw the sigma x, sigma y, sigma z axes for the generators of that. So Schiff has the discussion in his very elegant language. It is so compact that you will miss it if you are flipping through the pages, and has no diagram. So put n cap, here we have u n cap theta as the exponent of I times theta times sigma by 2 matrices dotted with n cap. Except that now theta goes from 0 to 4 pi. So we let theta belong to minus 2 pi to 2 pi. and actually it does not matter. So, we just put minus 2 pi to plus 2 pi. So, including the outer surface of this sphere. Okay. The big difference is that in SO3 we have to exclude the minus pi, because it will reproduce same thing as plus pi. I have rotated by pi around this way. If I rotated minus pi, I would have come to the same point. So, not to repeat, topologically have a unique set of points, I have to leave out this. But as far as SU2 is concerned, both minus 2 pi and plus 2 pi give 1, just gives the same element. So, there is no ambiguity. In fact, the SU2 is a space such that the whole of, I do not want to clutter up this image, but the whole of the outer surface is one point. So, you have to think of, so if you think in terms of, forget about n cap because it takes various values, but you let theta increase, you get a sequence of two spheres until you reach the outermost two sphere, which is corresponding to 2 pi, but that whole sphere is actually just one point. Topologically is the same thing. Okay, the connectivity is such that all of these points are actually just one point, they are not distinct points. It is just a limitation of our visualization in 3D, in fact drawing it on 2D, that we think of this as distinct points, but mathematically they become just one point. In the group sense, they are one and the same object. Okay, they are same point, same element of the group, its identity element, minus 1. Thank you. Identity is at the origin, it's minus the identity. Is topologically the same point minus the identity. On the SO3 space, the antipodal points will be corresponding points, and you have to leave out one of them. So, the punchline, topologically this object is S3, it is the sphere of 3 dimensions which we can't normally visualize within 3-dimensional space. And the analogy is the following: if you had a disk, you draw on it circles of growing size until you reach the outermost circumference, but you identify circumference to be one point. Then what will you get? It is like traveling from south pole of a 2-sphere ball to north pole. You have made the outer, you folded it up and it's like some of the sweets made. Okay, you take this and also make it into a same point. So, topologically you have created a 2-dimensional shell out of a 2-dimensional disk. This thing that we did is a sequence of 2 spheres such that the outermost 2 sphere is joined to be one point. So, it is a 3-dimensional shell in 4-dimensional real space. Okay. So, it is topologically what is called S3. So, S1 is circle, S2 is spherical shell in 2 dimension, and S3 is spherical shell of dimension 3. its intrinsic dimensionality is 3, just as the intrinsic dimensionality of a shell is 2. It's a 2 sphere, although it occupies 3 dimensions. Its ant walking on it only detects 2 dimensions. So an ant walking on this will detect 3 dimensions, but it will be a continuous and homogeneous space. You will not find any joint anywhere. So topologically the S2 is actually an S3, whereas topologically SO3 is not, and it's a slightly more complicated space. But what happens because of the double covering is that SU2 double covers this. So there are 2 copies of SO3 inside SU2, and after that covering it becomes a simply connected space. SO3 is not simply connected, but SU2 is. So we will see that next time.